Hello and welcome to Independent Sector's November monthly policy update. I am Ana Montañez, Government Relations Manager. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time on an IS webinar, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization representing a diverse set of nonprofit foundations and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people in the United States thrive. As part of our webinar feature, all lines are currently muted and we will pause periodically for questions. To ask questions, please type them in the Q&A box or email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the Independent Sector website and emailed to you next week. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I am joining you today from Washington, D.C., the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area and working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that many of the buildings and places we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by enslaved people. Wherever you're joining us today, we are very glad to have you with us. This sort of policy education events are historically a benefit for independent sector members, but we have opened them up to all during this pandemic to ensure that, of course, the charitable sector has access to the latest policy information at this critical time. I am joined today by Jessica Cameron, our trusted partner at Washington Council Ernst Young. And today we will talk about the latest legislative intelligence on Capitol Hill and the lame duck session. We will be going over what to expect as the deadline to fund the government approaches on December 11th. And then Jessica will give us an awesome presentation on the election breakdown and explore what that means for the 117th Congress. Well, without further ado, welcome Jessica, and thank you for joining us.
Great, it's great to be here. Thank you, Anna.
What a month November has been, right? Now with the presidential election behind us, and you would think that Congress is ready to get back to the negotiation table on another COVID-19 relief package to make sure that the government is funded, but it looks like the Senate already left for the Thanksgiving recess. So can you tell us what is the latest on Capitol Hill?
Absolutely. And I think since the last time we had a monthly policy update, there's been a lot of changes. I know a lot going on in the election space. So hopefully my goal today is to tell you kind of a breakdown of kind of what happened during the election, what it means for legislation next year, and then more importantly, what it means for the nonprofit community. So give me 1 second, I'm going to share my slide and we'll get started. All right, can everyone see? Great. So first I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of what happened with the election, what the breakdown looks like, and why that's important. So obviously we're in a presidential election year in 2020. News outlets declared 2 weeks ago, or 2 weekends ago, that Biden was the presumptive nominee for the White House with 290 electoral votes. He needed 270 in order to win the election. And since then, the count has him at about 306 electoral votes. So he'll be likely moving into the White House come January. But what's actually more interesting and what's important for also what happens in a Biden administration is what happened this election cycle with the Senate. Republicans currently control the Senate with 53 seats. And pollsters had really predicted this year that there would be a blue wave of Democrats, that Republicans would lose enough seats to lose the Senate. And so far, that really hasn't happened with the states with the members that were up for re-election this cycle. And I'll explain a little bit more why later on in the presentation. But so far, it means all the seats have now been accounted for, except for two, both in Georgia. And so as a result of state laws there, both seats will be up for a runoff election come January. So that's important because those two seats will determine, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, will determine who has Senate control for next year. Not to be forgotten is the House. So Democrats currently control the House with 232 Democrats in power. However, Democrats lost a few seats this cycle, and most of those Republicans were able to flip with women candidates. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So Republicans are really hoping that this next election cycle, they'll be able to emulate some of those additional gains in the 2022 election. So there's been a lot of noteworthy changes that will be happening in DC next year. Most notably, of course, is we have the first female and first African-American vice president with Vice President-elect Harris, which is very exciting. But even also very noteworthy is there are a number of demographic changes that are happening in Congress that I think are important to highlight. So I mentioned before that Republicans picked up several seats in the House side. One of the interesting statistics is that in every seat where a Republican candidate flipped a Democratic seat held by a Democratic incumbent, that Republican candidate was either a woman, a minority, or a veteran. And the vast majority of those were women that were running for office. So overall, you're going to see an increase in the number of women serving in the 117th Congress next year. You're also going to see an increase in the number of women of color that are serving in the 117th Congress. About more than a third of women in the 117th Congress next year will be women of color. And so whatever side of the aisle you're on, this is incredibly important. It means important progress for women as well as people of color that will be serving in Congress. And also important to note is that with a smaller majority in the House, it means that members on both sides will play a role. So really quickly, I wanted to mention a few kind of highlights that I think are really noteworthy. The first is that you have the first Korean American women, not woman, I should say. There are 3 Korean American women that will be elected to Congress next year, and that's a first for both chambers. So we have Michelle Steele, Young Kim, and Marilyn Strickland. You also have the second state to elect all women of color to the House of Representatives, which is very exciting in New Mexico. For some Thanksgiving trivia for your table, wherever that is next week, the first state to do so to elect all women of color was actually Hawaii in 1990. So kind of a fun fact. And also importantly, you'll have more millennials and young people serving in Congress. So we have the youngest Republican member elected to Congress, Madison Cawthorn. Mr. Cawthorn is the ripe old age of 25. For reference, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez set the record in modern history for the youngest serving member, and she was 29 when elected in 2018. So a lot of important changes going forward, which are exciting. So I talked about how there are 2 races that still have yet to be called, and those will determine kind of what happens in the Senate next year. And those 2 seats are both in Georgia, both in runoffs, with Senator Kelly Loeffler's seat as well as Senator David Perdue's seat. Overall, I just want to point out, there were several states where there were highly contested elections. So we had North Carolina, there was a lot of money sent into that state for the election between Tillis and Cunningham, as well as Maine, a very kind of important state to look at. Both of those were retained on the Republican side, but there are also several Democratic flips that happened, namely Arizona and Colorado. So overall, Republicans didn't do as poorly as originally expected. And either way, whatever works out as far as the 2 runoffs, you're going to have a razor thin majority either on the Republican or Democratic side, which will be important later for policies going forward. So here are kind of a few dates that I think are important to know. I know folks might be a little sick of 2020 and looking forward to 2021, but there are some really key dates that are important before the end of this year. I get a lot of questions about from clients as far as When is a presidential candidate officially declared the winner? I get that question a lot, most recently with this election. And the answer really has to do with the statute. There are several rules put in place to kind of determine when the election will be called. So first off, there's a safe harbor deadline. That's the kind of top left box if you're looking at the screen. And that deadline allows kind of free states from further challenge if they settle all legal disputes and certify the results at least 6 days before the Electoral College meets to vote. And so in that case, that safe harbor deadline is December 8th. Also, on December 14th, so 6 days later, electoral college delegates will ultimately cast their votes. And the deadline to send those votes to Congress is right before Christmas on the 23rd. So notice that additionally, with the Georgia runoffs that we discussed earlier, those aren't until January 5th. So what will happen is that the new Congress will come in on January 3rd with a Republican majority, the current makeup of the Senate for that year. And then we won't know ultimately the full results until a little bit later on January 5th. So point is that there's a lot happening in the next few weeks. Additionally, you have, of course, the inauguration on January 20th. And then we'll talk about this more later, but government funding will expire on December 11th, as well as tax extenders at the end of the year. So why do these two Georgia seats, these two elections matter? Why is this important? I think in any other year, we wouldn't be looking so closely at these runoff seats, but because of the makeup of the Senate currently and what it is projected to be next year, there's some huge implications to those. So if looking at the left-hand side, if Democrats win both of those Georgia runoffs, the Senate will be 50-50. And as a result, with the White House being in control by Democrats, it means that the Senate will have a majority to go forward. They'll be able to both control what legislation is brought to the floor and as well as the hearing schedule. That means that Biden's proposals that he's been talking about on the campaign are more likely to move forward with a Democratic Senate. Remember, the House is already Democratic controlled, and so that means he would have Democrats would have control of both the legislative as well as the executive branch. So there's a couple options for Democrats to pursue kind of their policy agenda. One thing to note is that in the nonprofit sector, as most of you know, that a lot of the rules that govern nonprofits are governed by the tax code. And so any tax changes that have to happen that Congress can make actually require different rules to pass legislation than other types of legislation. So they don't just need a simple majority, 51 votes to pass, but instead need 60 votes. That's important because given the current makeup of the Senate, that means that Democrats don't have enough votes to pass tax changes with the current 60 vote threshold. And instead, we'll look at other means in order to pass tax legislation. The main way to do that is through what's called the budget reconciliation process. And essentially what that means is that Senate would be allowed to pass certain bills with only 51 votes, a 51 majority. And given that if Democrats win both runoffs, that means that they would have a 51 vote majority with Vice President Harris as the tiebreaker. So as an example, for example, tax changes that affect the nonprofit sector that we've been looking at, of course, the universal charitable deduction. In prior years, the UBIT parking tax was passed, through a tax change. Other areas that Democrats will be looking at will be, of course, healthcare. The pandemic has brought kind of a huge spotlight on that issue. Also, areas like climate change, education, and housing. Looking at kind of the right-hand side, so if Republicans can win just one or two of those runoffs, they would then continue to control the Senate like they have in this Congress. It means that a lot of the major Democratic priorities that Biden has in place are likely to be blocked by the Senate. And so the Senate will be looking at changes like infrastructure, retirement, and kind of smaller tax issues that they'll be able to pass on a bipartisan basis. So the point is, major tax changes or major changes are unlikely with Biden's agenda if one of those runoffs goes to the Republicans. If not, Biden's kind of priorities are more likely to be in focus. And just to kind of back up for a second and look at kind of some of the Biden proposals that that we've been talking about. Obviously, there's been a real focus on infrastructure and clean energy. Looking at things like retrofitting and certain tax credits. Additionally, really a spotlight on caregiving, especially with the pandemic, looking at child care tax credit, universal pre-K, and also investments to advance racial equality, looking at diversity and inclusion. So the proposals that he's talked about are making the new markets tax credit permanent, as well as some other issues. Notice that, I know we're talking to a lot of the nonprofit community, but notice that a lot of those proposals have been suggested that to be paid for by tax increases on the corporate side. And so remember, we talked about what the makeup of the Senate looks like will really determine kind of what perspective and how far some of those priorities can go next year. Additionally, if the Senate maintains in Republican control, it means that you're more likely to see a lot of these priorities be moved by the Biden administration in executive order form, something that he can do unilaterally without the support of Congress. One thing that's important to keep in mind is kind of the historical perspective of what previous administrations have looked like in the first couple months of their administrations. And so this chart shows kind of the previous administrations and what major legislation pieces were passed right off the bat. And I want to take a moment just to really focus in on the Obama administration when they came in 2009. Remember that when Obama came into office, there was a deep recession that was happening. And so the focus of the first couple months of the administration were really on stimulus and getting the economy back to life. I think you're going to see something very similar with the Biden administration. We have the global pandemic that's caused significant issues in the economy. And so that will be really kind of first things first for the Biden administration to really sink their teeth into and to focus on. And that includes likely doing some type of stimulus legislation in Congress. So with any new incoming administration, that means it's new job season in Washington. There are over 4,000 political appointee jobs across the federal government that will need to be filled in the coming months, starting in January. But first, the transition team will need to pick certain key level positions, notably cabinet secretaries and kind of White House senior leadership in the coming months. So you'll see kind of those names roll out in the news over the next few weeks. What's important are a few things. One is that there are several positions that have already been filled on the White House side, specifically President-elect Biden's Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. He has previous experience in the Obama administration, serving as Biden's Chief of Staff while he was Vice President. And additionally, there are a number of potential picks that the transition team is looking at. Most notably is that there's been a real focus on getting more women into cabinet positions. You see this with one of the picks for Treasury Secretary. Remember, the Treasury Department governs a lot of the nonprofit structure as far as regulations and things that it can do. Lael Brainerd is a woman who has previous experience in the Obama administration as well as at the Federal Reserve, and she's been a front runner, someone that has previous experience with recessions. So it's important, I guess, just to keep in mind some of these names. Some of these you've likely seen from the Obama administration that harken back to that. And a lot of these picks are a lot of these cabinet secretaries not only will be advisors to the president, but will also be in charge of very large agencies. So they'll have a lot of discretion as far as the direction of where their agencies will go. So I know everyone's excited to get to 2021, but there's still a lot on tap for the rest of the year. So I wanted to really touch on those before I give it up to Anna. So there's kind of two things that in this lame duck session of Congress that Congress will focus on. The first is some type of coronavirus relief bill. Now we've been talking about doing an additional bill in addition to the CARES Act since the summertime. But one of the big issues has been kind of an arguing over how big the legislative package should be and what should be in it. So some of the kind of provisions that have been talked about as far as being included have been extension of unemployment insurance, which expired at the end of the summer, funding for state and local governments. State and local governments have been, very strapped for cash recently with all the measures taken because of the coronavirus and the decline in the economy. There's also been more specific areas I wanted to touch on for the nonprofit sector. So one being there's been talk of within a relief bill, an extension of the PPP program. Remember that program also applies to the nonprofits or certain nonprofits of a certain size. The House bill that was presented for an additional coronavirus relief package included election security and broadband funding measures, which has been important to the nonprofit sector, as well as an increase in the universal charitable deduction for this year to double it from $600 to $1,200. So those are kind of the key pieces that I've been looking at too. The big question will be whether they'll be able to strike a deal on the overall size before they get to kind of specifics that will be in play. The second piece is subtype of government funding bill. So Congress has to fund the government, and the new deadline to do that for this year is December 11th. So that'll be a key kind of issue that will be on the radar when members of Congress come back after Thanksgiving. There are also extenders that expire at the end of the year, several of which apply to nonprofits, so that I know the nonprofit community has been interested in, specifically the new markets tax credit, which is an incentive for investment in low-income communities, as well as deductions for certain higher education expenses, as well as the work opportunity tax credit. So a few kind of temporary tax measures within those tax extenders that I know folks have been interested in. So the point is that there's still a lot that Congress has to do before the end of the year, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how those pieces play out over the next few weeks. And finally, I touched on some of these earlier, but wanted to kind of wrap up with some of the key issues that independent sector and I know we're following for IS as well. Again, like I mentioned, currently, there's a temporary universal charitable deduction for this year, for this tax year. We've been tracking kind of what that potentially looks like for an upcoming package. Additionally, issues with regards to kind of securing the digital divide, as well as secure and safe elections, as well as for next year, kind of looking at what might happen with a possible infrastructure package or some of the other priorities that Biden has mentioned. So I will stop there, but happy to take any questions that have been coming up, specifically either about the election piece or kind of specific provisions that affect your organization.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for such a well-rounded presentation, very informative. As a woman, I can definitely, I'm really happy and stoked for the 117 Congress. I know that still a lot of work for Congress to look more like America's demographic, but I think
Absolutely.
we're moving in the right direction. So I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, please submit it in the Q&A box. Meanwhile, I have multiple questions. One of them is, as you mentioned, so we're still waiting to see who is going to have majority in the Senate, and with that, there's the possibility, right? We don't know who the chairmanship of the Senate Finance Committee is gonna go to, right? It could go to Senator Wyden if Democrats win, or to Senator Crapper, right? So what would the chairmanship of Senator Wyden look like for nonprofits if that happens, if that were to happen?
Sure. Well, you have kind of two very different options for the chairmanship for Senate Finance. You have, like you mentioned, Anna, you have Senator Wyden, who's currently the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. You also have Senator Crapo, who serves on Senate Finance. Currently, Chairman Grassley is the chairman, but his chairmanship will be up this year. It'll be interesting to see, I think, for ranking member Wyden, he's been a key supporter of the nonprofit community. He's someone that's been very focused on going after corporations, focused on particular provisions. So he's definitely someone that from Oregon who has more of a left-leaning background, I think will be kind of a more receptive than maybe a Republican chairman will be. That said, I think for Senator Crapo as a potential chairman, he's been on the committee for a long time. He's currently in charge of banking. He comes from a more rural state, from Idaho, and so it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out in the dynamics of him and the nonprofit community.
Right. Yeah, we'll definitely be in the lookout, of course. I'm very following very closely those Georgia races to see who's gonna gain majority in the Senate and ergo determine the chairmanship of the committee. We have a question here regarding, so what are you tracking and seeing regarding the universal charitable deduction? Do you anticipate an extension or an expansion? And to that question, I actually wanna ask you, what is also, in the Republican skinny package, there was the inclusion of an expansion of a $600 charitable deduction. And what do you think, could that be included if there's another COVID relief package, or what are the odds? And yeah, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. So there's kind of two pieces to this. One, that the nonprofit sector has been really focused on making a kind of permanent and larger universal charitable deduction. And that's something that I know IS has been very much focused on. There are a number of bills in both sides of Congress that have been introduced this Congress, and likely we'll see some of those pieces of legislation introduced next year as well. With the coronavirus and with the pandemic going on, in the CARES Act, there was, like you mentioned, a temporary universal charitable deduction of $600 for just this tax year, so not permanent. And there have been
that number is $300.
300, excuse me, yes, and it would double. So there have been recent efforts by Senate Republicans as well as some Democratic senators to double that to $600 for this year. So that's something that has been in the mix. It was, like you mentioned, in the Senate version of the stimulus bill that was out. That was released a few months ago. So that's definitely something that could come into the mix if a stimulus bill was going to be passed this year. I think the real question is going to be whether they can get to a stimulus agreement at all. And first and foremost, that means getting to a number. We've seen Senate House Democrats look at a number closer to $2 trillion or over that, whereas Senate Republicans have been more focused on a number closer to $1 trillion or even less than that, $500 billion. And so, that'll determine kind of what the pieces of the package look like and what they're able to include or not include. So likely, if the package is larger, that bodes better for the universal charitable deduction being increased this year.
Right. Well, thank you for that answer, Jessica. And I know that you kind of mentioned this in your presentation, but there are a lot of provisions from the CARES Act that are set to expire at the end of the year, right? And the ones that are really important, we just mentioned for the nonprofit sector, the $300 UCD, also the coronavirus relief fund and the employee retention tax credit. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, and right now everything is up in the air, unfortunately, but what do you think it's going to happen? Do you think Congress is just going to let them expire, or independently, if there's a coronavirus relief package or an omnibus, is there a chance of any of this to get renewed before they expire, or what is the forecast for them?
That's the million-dollar question. Recently, it's been interesting. There have been news reports that the Trump administration has kind of backed out of negotiations, leaving it mostly to focus on Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. So really getting Congress to negotiate amongst themselves as far as a final package. I think there's always been a willingness from both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, to come together on a stimulus bill. Clearly, the economy is not doing well. People have been out of work and are really hurting from not only the effects of the virus, but the effects of on the economy. And so I think there's hope on both sides that something will come together. I think if Republicans can agree to increase their number that they're willing to go up to as far as a price tag, and House Democrats are able to lower that and kind of meet in the middle somewhere, I think that bodes well for some type of relief. The question will be whether that can be done in the next few days, given just the short timeline that Congress has. Remember that they also have to pass a funding bill, so two separate things that are on their plates. And so there's a lot that they'll have to be focused on in the next few weeks.
Right. Yeah, no, and then this week, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows couldn't assure us if there was going to be or not a government shutdown, right? So hopefully that's not the case. But yeah, there's just a lot that has to happen in a short period of time, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think that we're up time. I don't see any other questions coming into the chat as right now. But I want to thank Jessica for sharing with us her incredible knowledge. And we're very grateful to you and Washington Council for their partnership and all your help in making sure that the priorities of the charitable sector are actually included in whatever comes next, the next couple of weeks. So thank you so much for everyone who joined us today, and we hope to see you in the next MPU in December. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jessica.